It's June 5, Ukrainian Media Center Forum starts its operation. My name is Svetlana Chiprenko, and now we will have a discussion of the sociological survey covering the attitudes of the Russian citizens to the ongoing war. And let me introduce our speakers. Joining us in the studio today are Vadym Denysenko, political scientist, Igar, Tyshkevich, expert at the Ukrainian Institute for the Future, and Volodymyr Nahirnyi, expert at the National Institute for Strategic Studies. So, Mr. Vadym, I think we should start with, in my opinion, with the presentation of the results of the sociological survey that was going on in Russian Federation. First of all, we would like to find out how is it possible to conduct a sociological survey in the territory of a belligerent state. What is the attitude of the Russians to the mobilization? What is their evaluation of their losses and attitude to the negotiations? Thank you very much for this opportunity, for having me here. Good morning, everybody. So this survey is not the first one that was conducted by our team in Russian Federation. In fact, with the beginning of the full-scale invasion, we conduct such studies in Russia to understand what's going on inside of their state in order to properly and correctly put the accents and not to get submerged in the myth, that sometimes Ukrainian and international society is experiencing. So the methodology was, we were using the telephone calls that covered 1,200 respondents, and it's a traditional method of the survey that we use all of the time. And the question that we ask is whether the situation in Russian Federation moving in the right or wrong way. Currently, de facto, within the last year, within the latest period, starting from the October 22, demonstrates the figure around 73% when the Russian citizens say that their country is moving in the right direction. It doesn't mean that they all live well. It doesn't mean that they all feel well. The right or wrong direction is their attitude of the Russian citizens to where the Russian officials are leading the country to. During some catastrophes or cataclysms like mobilization or something, there are some gaps in the answers, but basically 73% think that Russia is moving in the right direction. Talking about what can change the situation, only 38% say the end of the war and 35% say nothing should be changed. But again, the ending of the war becomes one of the most important factors, and war is the key factor, key element of perception about what's going or not going to happen to Russia and Russian citizens. And one of the most important things is that for the time being in Russian Federation, it's safe to say that the financial condition of a large fraction of Russian population is deteriorating. So talking about, well, we've asked, how did your income change within the last half a year? 32% say about improvement, 45% say that nothing has changed, and 23% state that their personal situation has deteriorated. And the next question is a traditional question, whether you're looking for additional job or a side job. Yes, I am, and I was able to find 20%, 18% say was looking for but never found, and 61% say they were not looking for. So 38% are forced to look for an additional job. And this means that at least more than 1/3 of the population of Russian Federation experiences deterioration of their financial condition that forces them to look for additional jobs and to think about their survival. And then comes the most interesting question that describes the best the economic condition of the average Russians. We've asked whether you have any savings for any case you lose your job. So no savings, 46%. So half of the population says they don't have even savings for 1 month of survival, 1 month of subsistence, of 1 month, and on 17%, and the same up to 17% can subsist up to 1 month, but again, the lowest level of life is the people who understand that they have nothing in case they lose their jobs. So basically 63% of Russians don't have any significant savings at all. And this is the key figure, in my opinion, that tells us what's going on with the economy of Russian Federation, because the Russian government says about the significant growth, the growth of pensions, salaries, GDP, and so on and so forth. But 63% of the Russian population have no means for subsistence in case they lose their job. Then we were asking one of the most important questions. Basically, everybody loves comparing today to the periods of the years 88, 89, the end of the existence of the Soviet Union. But back then there was a significant deficit. Nothing was on the shelves in the shops of the Soviet Union. Currently there is no deficit, but now the average Russians come across more and more counterfeit products because the manufacturers can do only two things: either to decrease the quality or to increase the price. And we've asked the Russian citizens, among which products have you experienced low quality products, in which group? So up to 38% said that that was food, and 41% says that there was no defective products in their consumption. So talking about those specific food products, first of all, here we're talking about the dairy products, beer, meat products, cigarettes, tobacco products, chocolate, and other things. So right here we can see very clearly how the sanctions work. So for example, Western beer manufacturers have withdrawn from Russian markets, which resulted in significant deterioration of relevant product category of products. Then traditional question: do you think that the economic losses correspond to the achievements of Russia during the war? 25% say that they do correspond, and then the losses are more, 36%, the achievements are more, the equal figure. And here we see the situation when 36% say that the losses are more than the achievements, but at the same time, well, we can say that 43% say that the achievements are more than the losses. But generally, if we understand that 20% are even afraid to say anything, the situation in Russia is currently 50-50. Basically, the half of them thinks that the losses correspond to the achievements, and the other half thinks quite the opposite. Also, within the latest period, there are more and more talks about so new and drop of regime, the tightening in Russian Federation, and we've asked an important question to understand how this tightening will be perceived by Russia further on. So the first question: do you support the Russian law enforcement agencies to be vested more authorities? So 49% said yes, and 38% said they do not support. So unfortunately, and 13% are afraid to state anything at all. So basically, in this situation, half of the population will support reinforcement of the role of law enforcement. And then we've asked more controversial question: in your opinion, should the policeman be entitled to open fire in public places? And here the story is quite the opposite. 77% are against. So if we translate it in human language, the Russians say they don't have anything against the Russian law enforcement agencies to be vested more authorities, but God forbid it concerns me. Then another question was: to what extent, in your opinion, Russia has achieved the goals of the special military operation. So in 46% of the cases, the population doesn't think that any of the goals were achieved. Then one of the most important questions: what's more important for you, the end of battle operations or holding on to the captured territories? The end of the battle operations, the Russians are getting used to the war. In February, this figure was 50, now it's 46%. Holding on to the newly captured territories, the number have increased compared to February. They really start thinking that the newly captured territories are their land and they should hold on to it and continue fighting for it. For us, it's a negative signal because Russian propaganda starts reaching out to the larger categories of Russians. Then we've asked about the opinions of the Russians to mobilization. This 40% say that the mobilization is ongoing and 50% say that mobilization is not or not visibly happening. Unfortunately, here the situation is such that in Russia within the last 2 years, Russia has learned a lot of lessons, and they've channeled their mobilization machine into the digital mode. And we have to understand that the repetition of autumn 2022 will not happen with mass protests because everything will be concealed through the state services, public services websites, and everything is going to happen way quieter than it used to be happening back in 2022. Because when we analyze what's going on in Russia, well, it would be way more difficult to establish any mobilization-based processes, and now the propaganda machine works on prevention of such riots. Then we asked yet another question: whether any of your family members would be, what is the probability of having your family member mobilized? That question would let us understand what's really going on. So the high probability 11%, 50-50 31%, low 14%. So basically 44% think that their families are in the risk zone. Unfortunately, the situation is in fact here is 50-50, so 50% think that they are outside the risk zone. Then another traditional and one of the most important questions for us: the evaluation of the losses of Russian Federation for the time being. Do you have any family members who were mobilized? 33% stated so. Are there injured among your family members? 19%. Missing in action and prisoners of war 1%, and died 18%. In fact, we have a situation when 40% of the population of Russian Federation say that among their family members, their closest family members, are either dead or injured. So they understand more or less what's going on in the front lines. And yet another important question for us is that it becomes a revelation for the people, and people stop being afraid talking about the real losses the Russian Federation is experiencing. And we're asking the question of the number of deaths in the front lines. Currently, 28% of the population say that the Russian Federation lost more than 100,000 life force during the war. And those who say that it's difficult to answer is 32%. Basically, those are the people who are afraid to say what they think, that they're just afraid to answer this question. So basically, we can safely state that at this very moment, Russians started clearly understand what are the real losses of Russian Federation in the war against Ukraine. Then we've asked if, in their opinions, the human losses correspond to the achievements of the special military operation. Yes, they do correspond 20%. The losses are more than achievements 49%. Achievements are more than the losses 14%. And difficult to say 15%. Well, I think we may safely say that for the time being, basically 50% of the population think that the losses are way more than the achievements, and the other half thinks quite the opposite. Meanwhile, 15% are just afraid to state anything. So basically here, half of the population of Russian Federation start adequately understanding what's going on and how is it going on. In fact, it's a huge breakthrough because just half a year ago, this figure was way less. And finally, we've asked about the floods in the Russian Federation that were happening recently, just to understand what people think about it. So attitude to the floods. We've asked whose fault is it? No one's fault. It was nature, 47%. Then 41% said it was the local governments. And the rest of the answers are within the statistical error. And basically after that, we've asked the people whether the local governments should be replaced. 59% say absolutely so, and 34% say that no, the government should not be changed. And when we've asked what government should be changed, only 26% say is the central government. So 25% is anti-Putin fraction of population, and based on our other sociological survey, we were able to witness that a quarter of population is anti-Putin. The rest are even afraid of starting to think that Putin can be criticized, and they said that the rest of the respondents say that the local government should be replaced. So those are the figures. And that's the end of the presentation on my end. Thank you very much, Mr. Vadym. So you've mentioned that the survey is periodic, it's regular, yes. And we can basically already observe some changes in the public opinion in Russian Federation. You've demonstrated some slides, but I'm just curious about your opinion. How did the situation change in Russian society? Their attitude towards mobilization, the special military operation, so-called, and generally public sentiment. Well, you know, it's difficult to state anything about something average because it's a broad question. Well, talking about mobilization, for example, mobilization is one of the biggest fears that exist in Russian society for the time being. They are more afraid of the deterioration of their financial stance, and now we can state it for the first time that within the last 3 months it was the first time when the major fraction of population see the interrelation between deterioration of their financial condition and the war. What conclusions they draw from this is the whole different question, but their attitude to mobilization. So mobilization has become a problem number 2. Just half a year ago, it ceased to be a problem number 1. Now it's problem number 2, and their attitude to mobilization is like, God forbid it touches me. God save me from that special military operation. But talking about the rest of the things, they are completely pro. So, Mr. Igar, in your opinion, why is it important for us as Ukrainians to understand what is the public sentiment in Russian Federation? So let me start with the second question, or the second part of your question. It would be illogical not to know what's going on the side of your enemy as we're fighting this war, because we like to talk about the psyops of Russian Federation, but it's a road with 2 sides, you know, and it's Ukrainian tragedy that such surveys are almost non-existent in Ukraine about what's going on in Ukraine, because our enemy conducts such surveys. They try to use information and physical different measures, you know, they play on our public sentiment, and we don't do so. Unfortunately, the biggest thing our propaganda machine can do is only fight in the face, but it's only 1/20th maybe of all of the psyops. And talking about the public sentiment towards mobilization, well, an average Russian, they think about how to evade the mobilization, but if we consider the change of the system, Vadym has mentioned that they switched to electronic mode of draft notices, for example, but again, if we recall the first part of the slides, where the questions were about the deterioration of financial condition, or when people were saying they don't have savings, but part of the population say their financial condition has improved. And in some depressive regions, the recruiting system unfortunately works, because for the larger part of the population who have a lot of loans, and the level of borrowings is pretty high in Russia, and for them even the grace period, and if they can make any money, for example, for a wife, if their husbands either come back in coffin or injured or heavily injured, they don't really care. For them, it's a chance to switch to a different level of living. So even without any savings, some fraction of the population will safely state about the improvement of their financial condition. Because now the Russian government pays significant funds. I mean, they make significant disbursements that became a significant mechanism of influencing the public sentiment. So, some are afraid, but to get mobilized, but if they get mobilized, what they say, like, oh, okay, let it be like this, at least we're gonna have some disbursements. So, and then Mr. Volodymyr, in your opinion, Mr. Vadym mentioned there are some fears, there are some controversial opinions and thoughts that we were able to see in these surveys. In your opinion, still, what are the key problems existing in the Russian society? Well, I won't be repeating what my colleagues have already mentioned about the fears of mobilization and deterioration of financial condition, but I would rather try to look at the results of this sociological survey under a different angle, because on one hand we see some giant figures, the number of persons declaring that the things are moving the right way, and those are not only the results of our survey. If we consider Russian sociological surveys that are in open source, the figures are pretty much the same in both pro-government surveys and so-called Russian opposition surveys. So the situation is pretty much like this, but there are some aspects that we should pay attention to. For example, as we talk about Russia, the first thing we should pay attention to is that Russian socialism is vertically oriented, and basically in case of any problem they address the government with that problem. For them, all of the social life is happening with the participation of the government. The horizontal ties are very weak. There is no civil society. In fact, there are no skills of solving the problems on a horizontal level. Basically, the full dependency on the government as a social unit is a normal situation for the Russians, and it creates certain problems as well, because on one hand they really support the government, they really have pro-war consensus and support of the Putin's policy aimed at revanchism, a return of the Russian greatness, conquering Ukraine, all that propaganda set of statements, but from this survey we can already see that they start pondering over the price, and when they realize that sooner or later they will come to this choice, as we used to say, between the TV and the refrigerator, so between continuing to support the propaganda narratives in the situation where the life is really deteriorating, or start asking questions, and they will come to this need of asking questions, but they have no mechanisms of asking questions. And we currently in Russia we only witness one single example of horizontal interaction at attempts of pressing on the government is the movement of the wives of those mobilized. But what we see is this movement is weak, but in a situation when there are no other similar forms of activities, it becomes visible. How can it work in the future? Well, it's difficult to say so far, given that there are no skills of horizontal interaction. It's hardly worth hoping that it would result in some problems in Russia and emerging of some breaking points along that line. But on the other hand, the key problem for the time being the problem of the Russian government vertical is the infringement of non-formal social agreement within which the government was ensuring more or less decent way of life for the Russians and some improvements. In exchange, Russians were refuting any pressure over the government and interfering the government affairs. Now we see that the government has more and more trouble with satisfying the material requirements of the Russians, but with that understanding, the Russian government only increases the pressure. As Vadym mentioned, this concept of new Andropov regime, the government sees that the population starts having some elements of dissatisfaction, and they start suppressing those elements of dissatisfaction with force. And basically for currently existing Russian elites who remember the time of Andropov, they think that it's an optimal reaction. What can it result in? Well, we still don't have sufficient data for analysis, but the option set may vary from establishment of totalitarian regime all the way until the famous Russian riot, senseless and remorseless. The probability of both scenarios is pretty low, but the fact that there are certain processes, important processes going on along that government vertical, it is demonstrated both by this survey and other similar surveys, and it only emphasizes for us that we should continue keeping track of what's going on in Russia and respond accordingly. Mr. Igar, please. Right, the Russian society is vertically oriented, and it's true that currently the decision-making system reformatting is going on in Russia. This concept was formulated by Vadym. Vadym called it New Andropov regime, but I call it Neo-Tsarism. But basically, the basic concept coincides. So 25% of the population blame all of their problems on the central government. But what about the rest 75%? Remember that nice formula that the Tsar is good, but other government officials are bad. And this formula works perfectly in this case too. So who's to blame over the floods? So whose fault is it? let's blame it on nature. And then who should be changed? That was the government officials, the local governments. So the central government is good, but the local governments are bad in this case. No, the representatives of the local governments, you know, according with the newly captured territories of Ukraine, Russia has 89 federal subjects, and in 86 of them, the local governments never lived in those areas before before being appointed as a government to that region. So there is Putin, the Tsar on top, and there are his representatives in the region, and this scheme is copied in the smaller scale over the regions. So the reaction of Kremlin to what's happening in Russia, someone was promoted, someone was demoted, but then there will be extra additional elections in 7 subjects of Russian Federation. Probably until this year, this number will grow up to 10. So those will be the most high-scale elections of the local governments in Russia within the last long period. Some of our journalists, some of our politicians think that there might be some riots in Russia, but unfortunately that's not gonna happen. It can happen if you know what points to press, but now that we do not, we hardly can hope for the riot. Now I am inviting our journalists to ask questions from the floor. Please raise your hand in case you have any questions, and we will pass the microphone over to you. What was the number of the respondents of your survey? I apologize, it was written on the second slide. I've just failed to mention it. So 1,200 respondents covered by telephone survey all over the territory of Russian Federation of different age groups, and the statistic error was below 2.85%. Thank you very much. Do you have any more questions on the floor? There will be a question in English language in case you need to no, it will be in Ukrainian. Igor Chicharinda, I'm the major of the armed forces of Ukraine for the time being. Volodymyr has mentioned the riots or the protests of the wives of those mobilized, like that movement, Bring Our Husbands Back. We've seen it, those women kneeling in front of the Ministry of Defense, that those pictures were over all of the media. Is it, do I understand it correctly, but that is the only one like the support of this movement will be one of the areas of target areas of support by the special services of Russian special services of Ukraine. What are other areas that we can press on in Russian Federation, you know, on information level? Now PSYOPs comes to quite a serious level. And another question in continuation of this topic of wives and the military, about the prisoners of war. Now in the eve of the peace summit that is going to happen in Switzerland, Ukrainian government, Ukrainian president, we have the coordination headquarters and the main directorate of intelligence. We try to promote this agenda of exchanging everybody for everybody. We know that Russians do not want to exchange ours. They know that they are prisoners of war in Ukraine. They are well fed and they are kept in good conditions. You know, and what happens to our prisoners of war in Russia, we can only judge it from the pictures that emerge online, where people look as they live in concentration camps. So what is the attitude of Russians to the exchange of the prisoners of war? Do they even think about their prisoners of war? Do they support this idea currently promoted by Ukrainian government to exchange all for all? Well, we were asking this question during a previous wave of survey. I don't think the situation could have changed dramatically as of 1.5 months ago, as we've asked whether it's worth exchanging all for all. 58% of the Russians said yes, and 4% say categorically no, and the rest of the answers was like difficult to answer, or other conditions were to increase the number of Russians to be exchanged. But again, the vast majority of the Russians absolutely support the idea of exchanging all for all. And that was one of the trigger topics, in my opinion, for Russian Federation, because in fact they tried to conceal this topic of the prisoners of war. This topic does not exist in Russian information space, in their media, talking about the women, about the wives of the mobilized. We continue asking the Russians about the activities of such organizations, and we have to understand that the soft actions, quote unquote, of Russian Federation are related to the fact that those organizations, they have some support within the Russian public. So if we ask whether the Russians support the activities of such organizations, they are supported by 70%, about 67% of respondents. And we have to understand that the Russian government is really afraid of such things as women's organizations, mothers organizations, because they remember what was going on during Afghan and Chechen war, when the committees of soldiers' mothers played one of the most important roles in communicating the truth about what's going on in the battlefield and around it. And here we have to state that the Russians started actively preparing to clear this field of the women's organizations, started from 2014, and the most active phase of clearing was started in the year 2020, when the most of those organizations, they were quite influential in the most of the regions of Russian Federation. So those organizations were marginalized or suppressed, or they were labeled as the enemies of the state. And it's quite important aspect for us that a couple of days ago, after the key organization in Russia called A Way Home, the women's organization, who are wives and mothers of the military, they were labeled in Russia as a foreign agent, and they've posted it on their Telegram channel that the government labeled them as the foreign agent. And that was the first time after the Kharkiv breakthrough when people, without covering their faces with someone else's names, directly tell their government to go do, you understand what, with themselves. And basically here we're saying that 78% of the Russians support such organizations. Russian government is afraid to use any force against them, and they are afraid to touch them, but I understand that they work with other people who would at least theoretically like to join their activities. Mr. Volodymyr, please. Well, this is exactly the episode with those pictures of the representatives of that movement, the women kneeling in front of the Ministry of Defense. So among the organizers of that protest, there were no representative of this organization, The Way Home, who were labeled as the foreign agents. For what I understand, there were there were probably representatives during the protest, but not among the organizers. And again, this is probably the element of the work of Russian government with this kind of crowd. On one hand, they were responded harshly, but on the other hand, through different half-legal Russian pro-government information resources, there's the footage in all of them where people do not quarrel with the government, but rather they are kneeling in front of the Ministry of Defense, and thus they create certain chaos in information space to demotivate those who can potentially join such movements. Whether it should be the main area for our efforts. I think that is more of a concern to the Russians themselves. Using those information capabilities that we have, we can pay attention to those phenomena or try to emphasize their activities with our offers, but it's something that's going on inside Russian social, and for us it's important whether the population can compete with the government on this subject. Well, at least if there are 25% of those who do not agree, they can express themselves. They did express themselves when there were elections in Russia, for example, when they were creating hype around Dontsova, but they are still incapable of resorting to direct action. They need more time for this. Mr. Igar, I was talking more about the psyops. I recall the story of Benjamin Franklin, who was printing fake articles that the Indians scalped the Americans on request of the Brits. I mean, psyops existed since the times of the American War for Independence. My question was whether we should focus on such stories in our psyops, such stories as the movement of the soldiers' martyrs, because a movement like this resulted in the end of the First Chechen War. Well, if we talk about the soldiers' martyrs, unfortunately, the Russians, they learn too, and frequently they learn successfully. Well, because if we consider those committees of the Russian mothers, they create so-called pocket organizations, and in parallel they create the waves during which the families of those who were mobilized and those who perished say how cool it was because it works in different ways. And for the fraction of population who, for example, like a typical example is the Republic of Tiva, where the salaries are relatively high, but at the same time the unemployment rate is officially at 20% level. So basically, and again, the level of borrowings is quite high for this region, for Smolensk, for Pskov region. The option when a husband, a brother, a father left for war and has never came back, but there was a significant disbursement. Well, for those families, this scheme works just perfectly. So we shouldn't consider just like that format with the organizations, with the women's organizations, but you know, psyops doesn't work like this, that you invest your money to in some area and it worked perfectly. There are different tension points in Russian society, but they're not so intense so far. But as it was mentioned, for example, the food products are deteriorating and Russians start having quite nervous attitude to, for example, correlation of the influence of China and influence of Russia. So basically we can emphasize this or that tension point. They have no mainstream. They play on, say, 15 or 20 different narratives, but the question is who creates those narratives? First of all, thank you very much. So another question, and it will be in English language. So use.
NHK Япония. I'd like to ask you about you were talking about information space in Russia, and have you asked the responders about information sources they are contacting or they are getting information from?
Well, I can answer in Ukrainian, right? Basically, yes, of course, we keep asking this question on a regular basis. And for the time being, we can safely state that there are the two key information sources that the Russians use. That's TV and Telegram channels. Those are the two sources of information for population of Russian Federation. The third one is traditional internet, I mean the news websites, and then goes YouTube and TikTok. So that's the whole story. But talking about the comprehensive information picture, there's a big gap between generations. So generation up to 30 years, in fact, do not watch television. Meanwhile, those aged 55 plus years, they read a lot of Telegram, but TV is still dominating. Do we have any more questions?
You have surveyed the source of information, and have you invented or how do you think about the approach of affecting the information space in Russia from Ukrainian side?
Ну, в принципі, на сьогоднішній момент
Basically, for the time being, let me answer like this. I really have problem with all collective West, starting from the United States and other countries attending the Geneva conference, refusing any psyops in Russian Federation. So for the time being, we can safely state that the situation that existed during the Cold War, when there was at least BBC, Voice of America, and other news sources that were breaking the information silence wall in Soviet Union. Currently, the West refused to do any psychological operations in Russia. The West really supports the media related to Russian opposition, but that's the topic of a whole different discussion. But that's not the information war, in fact, not something that can bring the end of Putin's aggression against Ukraine closer. Mr. Igar, please. Well, to understand the Russian information space, we were all preparing such surveys. I was personally analyzing the information field and who manages it. So first, it seems like really there's a lot of different mass media in Russia. But talking about elites, the scheme is very simple. So first, it's Kovalchuks who control the first channel, Gazprom. Gazprom controls NTV. Gazprom Media is the new TV that emerged pretty recently in the middle of the 90s. That was not part of the Soviet heritage. Then, talking about old traditional mass media such as newspapers, it's Sobyanin, some from the military. Talking about internet, it's controlled by Gref and Kiriyenko group, because formally even VK group belongs to Gazprom Media, but the real manager is the son of Kiriyenko. All of the Russian news aggregators, all of the search engines, social media, everything is concentrated within the hands of one group that specializes in work with the young population. And there was a question about Telegram. What about Telegram? And back in 2022, when there were problems in the front lines, Putin had problems in Telegram, but there was a meeting with the official bloggers. There was a war against Telegram when a number of news correspondents were arrested. And when we were talking about the heritage of Prigozhin and his group of Telegram channels, there's the name of a new controlling person emerging, and it's again Kiriyenko. So talking about Russian information space, yes, it may seem diverse, but there is the real competition only among a couple of influence groups which are all gathering around Vladimir Putin. For example, if we consider different electronic news sources like RBK and Kommersant, that they gauge the area where they can criticize Putin and Kremlin, for example, and some others resort to straight propaganda, but they all work for one goal. And yes, there are points of interest to the Russian information space. People keep being curious, but again, those psyops, not information warfare. If you want to promote your news sources, they should mimic the Russian ones. It's naive when, for example, Ukrainian language speakers say, like, we're going to promote Ukrainian language news for Russia, but who's going to listen to your news in Ukrainian in Russia, right? Well, another last question for today, very technical question. Did the respondents know that that was the survey conducted by Ukrainian sociologists? I mean, it's important to understand them being prone to contact you. Well, they were given the right answers. Well, we would like to wrap up here. Let me remind you, we were talking about the attitude of the Russian citizens to the ongoing war, and Ukraine Media Center will continue its operation at 1400, and we will talk about the new rules of trade with agricultural products with European Union. Stay tuned.